As all the passengers you will hear about discovered, being denied boarding for a cruise not only turned their dream vacation into complete disarray, but also lost them a fortune, as cruise lines do not refund guests when they deny boarding to them. They argue it's up to us as passengers to pay really close attention to any rules and requirements, whether it's the cruise lines or even the countries that we're calling upon. Welcome aboard. I'm Gary Bembridge, and after seeing reports of more people than ever being caught out these days, I want to make it easier for you to avoid the things that could get you denied boarding, many of which I stumbled upon and am wrestling with as I was getting ready to board a cruise on Cunard's Queen Anne as I was making this. One reason that was really fresh in my mind was after a group of 10 guests were refused boarding on my previous cruise, an Oceania Vista Caribbean cruise out of Miami. The ship was due to sail at 4 o'clock and they arrived half an hour before that due to flight delays. They were relieved to get there on time. However, they were not allowed to check in and board at all. Cruise lines have a final check-in and boarding time, which is usually about an hour before the cruise departs. And this is due to local customs and immigration authorities' requirements. So those poor unfortunate guests had to watch while the gangway was eventually pulled back after they arrived and the ship set sail without them. Now this made me double check my Cunard Queen Anne boarding pass, which clearly says on it I must be checked in and on board by 4:30 p.m, even though the ship is only leaving at 6 p.m. So arriving later than 4 p.m, I'm likely to be denied boarding. So it's really important to always know the final boarding time to avoid the fate of that Oceania Vista group. But it seems the most common reason cruisers are denied boarding is also the one that I personally fret about the most too, which is not having the right documents to travel. What I need varies based on where I'm cruising, which makes it trickier. But I've discovered there are three critical things to focus on. The first is around passport and identification. While some cruises starting and ending in the United States, like some Caribbean cruises and Alaska cruises, allow United States nationals to use a birth certificate and a government-issued photo ID, every single cruise line I checked with recommend using a passport even for those. That's because if something goes wrong and you need to leave the cruise and return home, not having a passport makes it extremely difficult to do. However, if you do decide to cruise with a birth certificate, it must be the official state-certified birth certificate and the original copy, because photocopies are not allowed. Your government-issued photo ID, like say your driver's license, must also exactly match the name on the birth certificate too, or you could be denied boarding. Also, by the way, check if your itinerary does allow the birth certificate option. Last year, dozens of guests were refused boarding on a 10-day Princess Caribbean cruise out of Port Everglades because it included a transit into the Panama Canal and calls into Central America. So guests had to have a passport to call on those countries. Now, even though some of the guests had called Princess and been told that a birth certificate was okay, Princess refused refunds and any compensation. And the statement they issued after the event said, I'm going to quote, "Passengers need to take responsibility for their mistakes." It then went on to say, "It is the passenger's sole responsibility to ensure they have proper documentation. Even if a cruise representative provided wrong information, it's still the passenger's responsibility." So as I said at the start of this, we need to be very sure we have exactly the right documents. But having a passport also comes with some watch-outs. First, every cruise line I checked with says the passport must be valid for 6 months after the end of the cruise, or you will be denied boarding. This is mostly due to requirements by many countries that cruisers call on. Now, some countries also require a certain number of blank pages. For example, when I headed off on a cruise earlier this year to South Africa, I had to have a minimum of 2 blank pages so they could put the visas in the passport. Thirdly, if you're cruising in the European Union, so most likely the Mediterranean, due to a quirky rule, your passport expiry date must be within 10 years from the date of issue. So for example, if you've perhaps had your passport expiry date extended for some reason, perhaps even to cover the period of your cruise, you will be refused boarding in Europe. This happened to an English couple recently, Andrew and Sandra Sutherland. They went to check in for a Cunard Queen Victoria cruise to Spain and Portugal recently, and because their passport had been extended, they refused boarding. The cruise line would not refund them anything. Another thing to bear in mind is your reservation must be in the same name as on your government issued identification to avoid being denied boarding. And by the way, if your name has changed for any reason, you must bring official documentation to show why your name is different. For example, a marriage license, a government issued name change document, or anything that proves that your name has legally changed. That's also important if you're traveling with kids who are not your own or have a different surname. If you're traveling with a child that's not your own, perhaps you're taking, I don't know, your grandchild, a niece or a nephew on a cruise, then you need to have a notarized form signed by the child's guardian, or you will not be allowed to board. If your child has a different last name to you, you also need to bring any sort of official document to explain why the child's name is different, and it must be the original or a notarized copy. The next important thing is visas. I see so many cases of cruises being denied boarding for this one, and it's definitely one that I fret about, and it's a live topic for me because the cruise I'm going on after the one that I'm doing on Queen Anne is a cruise to Alaska. It starts in the United States from Seward but ends in Vancouver, Canada. Now, the risk of what could go wrong with visas was brought home to me after reading about Sherry Ramett and her husband. They decided to take their teenagers on a cruise to Alaska on Norwegian Encore out of Seattle. As non-US residents like me, they needed to get their United States ESTA visas to be able to fly into the United States, board the ship, and visit Alaska ports. However, they hadn't thought to get a Canadian ESTA or visa, so they were denied boarding without any refund in Seattle because their cruise was calling into Canadian port and they lacked the required Canadian visa. As a reminder, if you're sailing out of Vancouver on an Alaska cruise and not a United States national, you're going to need a US ESTA or visa if you're going to visit Alaska. You will be turned back if you don't have one when you try and embark. If you're a United States citizen, the rules are slightly different, again showing how we all need to make sure we know the exact requirements. At the time of making this, the Canadian government does not require US citizens to have a visa, but you need to check. No matter where you're cruising to, always check if you need a visa, and remember things change. For example, the European Union is introducing a system like the United States and Canada, an ESTA visa. So anyone who's not an EU national will start to need to get this before they can cruise in Europe. This is a completely new rule. Another reason that I see cruisers refused embarkation is one that is only the case on some cruise lines and in some destinations, which is why people get caught out. This is for not having travel insurance and, importantly, the right type. So, for example, for this Queen Anne cruise, Cunard require anybody that is booked in the United Kingdom, whether it's via a travel agent like I've done, online or directly with Cunard, irrespective if you live in the UK or not, to have travel insurance. And then it must be of a very specific kind. So Cunard say the policy must include cruise cover, cover the full length of the trip, all the destinations being visited, and include medical and repatriation cover for not less than 2 million UK pounds. That's about 2.4 million US dollars. At the terminal, I know I have to show it. I have to prove that I've got insurance. I had to do that on my last Cunard cruise too. Other lines sailing out of the UK also require this. Always check if you're required to have travel insurance to board. I found that while many lines recommend it, it's not a requirement or reason for denying boarding in many parts of the world. The only other cruises where I know I've had to prove it to date have been expedition cruises to remote places like Antarctica and the Canadian Arctic. But it is important to check. There are, by the way, also several age and condition related reasons that I'm also seeing people denied boarding at check-in, starting with this really important one. Cruise lines all have strict rules around pregnancy. So for example, I can see reviewing the rules for my Queen Anne trip that Cunard will not carry guests who've entered or will enter their 24th week of pregnancy during the cruise. Anyone checking in who's showing a pregnancy must produce a letter from their doctor or midwife saying they're in good health to travel if the pregnancy is progressing normally, and it must include an estimated date of delivery calculated from the last menstrual period or based on an ultrasound. Now this does catch people out. For example, recently an Australian Gold Coast resident called Kaylee Farrington, she was really excited checking in for a Carnival Luminosa cruise in Brisbane, but she was denied boarding because during check-in the people realized that she was pregnant, and then they found out that she was 26 weeks pregnant, so she was turned away again at her own cost with no refunds. I also noted that Cunard, like all other lines, including Disney that I checked, will refuse boarding to anyone traveling with a child under the age of 6 months and under 12 months on world cruises, exotic and transatlantic cruises. While I've not seen many cases of people being denied boarding for innocently or mistakenly packing items from the cruise line prohibited list, so that's things like irons, drones, alcohol, through to something that even kind of looks like a weapon, I have seen it where cruisers refuse permission for a search of themselves or their bags. In most cases, prohibited items will be confiscated when spotted through kind of hand or check-in bag screening, unless it's drugs or actual weapons. For example, earlier this year, a Texas woman called Melinda van Veldhuizen, she was both denied boarding and in fact banned for life by Carnival Cruise Lines for trying to take CBD gummies on board to help her sleep. She was going through check-in security at Port Miami screening. They spotted the bag of CBD gummies in her backpack. She'd bought them legally online as they're allowed in the state that she lives in, so she assumed she could bring them on the cruise. Carrying recreational drugs will have you denied boarding. Trying to take weapons likely will too. Sort of linked to that, although I've never seen it personally firsthand, if cruises are disruptive, threatening, or causing chaos and issues at check-in, especially if drunk, the cruise lines will deny boarding too. Now, I've seen some lines update their guidelines recently, which makes me think this must be kind of a growing issue. So for example, P&O Cruises, which is a sister line of Cunard here in the UK, has recently published this warning as part of an update to their alcohol policy and pricing as well. And it says, and I quote, "We reserve the right to deny access to the ship to anyone who appears to be heavily under the influence of alcohol." One area that seems less clear on if you will be denied boarding or not is around COVID. So for example, for my Queen Anne cruise, in the documentation, Cunard says that if I'm experiencing symptoms of COVID-19 or I test positive in the 3 days prior to embarkation, I need to declare that at the terminal to the check-in staff, and then the onboard medical team will do a screen and assess if I'm okay and fit to travel and board. However, some other cruise lines I've reviewed say online that they will refuse boarding if I did arrive showing signs of COVID or have COVID. For example, Norwegian Cruise Lines online, certainly at the time of making this, says that any guests with very high temperature or who've got COVID or been in contact with someone who's got COVID are unlikely to be allowed to board. So make sure you know your specific cruise line rule on that. If you'd like to know other quirky and unusual rules and things that happen on cruises, join me in this video where I talk about some unusual things that I do on cruises that most people don't know about but makes a big difference. See you over there.